The sky above Dry Creek was a dull sheet of pewter, heavy with rain that threatened to spill at any moment. The air was thick, still, and strangely expectant. In the center of town, the wooden platform of the auction stage groaned under the weight of muddy boots and restless shifting. People stood in loose clusters, some smoking, some muttering to each other in low tones, their eyes fixed on the spectacle about to begin. Ruth Marlowe lingered at the edge of the square, her arms folded tight. Across her chest, she wasn't here to buy, she told herself. She rarely came into town, except for supplies, and never for events like this. But after hearing the blacksmith's boy mutter something about a batch of orphans up for the block, she had found herself hitching her horse and riding in without much thought. The stage creaked again, and the auctioneer, a wiry man, with a voice as sharp as a whip, strode forward. "Ladies and gents," he called, sweeping off his hat in a mock bow, "we've got a rare sight for you today." From behind the curtain, 3 small figures were pushed forward, each wearing a coarse burlap sack over their head. They shuffled awkwardly, their bare feet slapping against the wet wood. The crowd's murmurs deepened. "Why the sacks?" someone called out. The auctioneer grinned with a few too many teeth. "Some buyers don't like to see the faces," says, "it keeps things cleaner. You'll just have to trust me, they're fine stock." Ruth felt her jaw tighten. She'd seen animals treated with more dignity. The children, 2 taller shapes, and one noticeably smaller, stood close together, their shoulders almost touching. Their clothes were threadbare, patched in places where the fabric had worn too. Nothing. Rain began to spit from the sky, fat drops darkening the wood beneath their feet. "Let's start the bidding," the auctioneer barked. 3 young ones, hardy and obedient, perfect for work around the farm or house. Silence. Number 1 moved. A few men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other as if waiting for someone else to speak first. Ruth found her eyes lingering on the smallest figure. Their shoulders shook not from cold, she thought, but from some deeper tremor. Something about the way the child's hands clenched into tiny fists made her stomach twist. "Come now, folks," the auctioneer coaxed, "don't make me lower the price right out the gate." The rain began to fall harder, drumming on hats and shoulders. Ruth stepped back, thinking this was her cue to leave. She had no business here. She had enough to keep herself afloat on her ranch. She didn't need this. She turned, her boots splashing in a shallow puddle, and froze. Through the patter of rain and the low hum of the crowd, a voice reached her, small, muffled, coming from beneath one of those burlap sacks. Ruth, her name. She turned slowly, her pulse quickening. The crowd still faced the stage, unaware, but the smallest child had their head tilted ever so slightly in her direction. She couldn't see their eyes, but she could feel them, searching for hers through the coarse weave of the sack. Ruth's breath caught. She'd never seen these children before. She had no kin here, no reason for any of them to know her name. And yet, the auctioneer slammed his palm against the railing. "No bids. Fine, we'll drop the price." "Half what I was asking." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but still, no one stepped forward. That voice echoed in Ruth's mind, soft, trembling, impossibly certain. She should have walked away. She told herself she was imagining it, and yet her feet were already carrying her forward, cutting through the crowd until she stood just a few paces from the stage. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. Well, Mrs. Marlowe, is it? Didn't take you for the buying type." Ruth's gaze stayed on the smallest child. "What's the price?" The man grinned, sensing an easy sale. "For you, let's say I'll pay it." Ruth interrupted, her voice steady. There was a murmur from the crowd, a mix of surprise and gossip starting to bubble. She was the last person they expected to step into something like this. The auctioneer clapped his hands, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "Sold. To the widow Marlowe." As Ruth climbed the few steps to the platform, the rain soaking into her coat, the smallest child tilted their head again. She still couldn't see their face, but she could feel that strange pull between them. She took the rope that bound their small wrists, more gently than anyone had touched them that day, and though she didn't understand why, one thought kept echoing in her mind. "Who are you, and how do you know my name?" The rain was coming down in a steady sheet now, cold enough to seep into Ruth Marlowe's bones. She kept her head low as she led the 3 children from the stage, ignoring the whispers and sidelong glances of the townsfolk. They had always thought her strange keeping to herself on that big ranch after her husband's death, refusing invitations, never seeking company. Now, buying 3 mysterious orphans with sacks over their heads would fuel their gossip for months. She didn't care, or at least, she told herself she didn't. The auctioneer's hired hand shoved the children toward her with little ceremony. The smallest one stumbled forward, nearly falling into the mud, but Ruth's hand shot out, steadying them by the arm. She expected them to flinch away from her touch. They didn't. "Thank you, ma'am," the hired hand said with a smirk that carried no gratitude, only relief at being rid of them. "They're all yours." Ruth didn't respond. She took the rope that bound their wrists together and turned toward the hitching post where her wagon waited. Her mare, Daisy, stamped her hooves impatiently, eager to be away from the noisy square. She helped each child climb into the back of the wagon, her eyes lingering on the smallest one again. Their shoulders were hunched, their heads still covered by the coarse sack. She wanted to pull it off, see their face, demand to know how they knew her name, but the middle child, taller and bony, was shivering so hard that Ruth decided it was better to get moving before any of them caught a chill. The road out of town was a ribbon of mud, the wagon wheels creaking and groaning as Daisy pulled them steadily forward. Rain drummed on the canvas cover stretched over the wagon's frame, muting the sound of the town fading behind them. For a while, no one spoke. The children sat close together, their bound wrists resting in their laps. Ruth glanced back once, twice, waiting for one of them to say something. Finally, she cleared her throat. "You three got names." The middle child gave a small shake of their head. "You can speak, can't you?" she pressed. The tallest one nodded, though still silent. Her gaze slid to the smallest child, the one who had spoken her name. "What about you?" The sack shifted slightly, as if they'd turned their head toward her. "Yes, ma'am." The voice was the same as before, small, trembling, but certain. Ruth tightened her grip on the reins. "Then maybe you can tell me how you know me." The child hesitated, fingers twitching against the rope. I just do." "That's not much of an answer." Silence again. The other two children glanced at their smaller companion, but said nothing. The rain hissed against the canvas, filling the space where words should have been dot by the time the wagon reached the open prairie. The clouds had begun to break apart, streaks of pale gold bleeding through. Ruth's ranch sat low against the horizon, its weathered fence posts leaning like tired soldiers. The barn roof sagged in one corner, and the house, 2 stories of faded timber, looked like it had been standing since the day the prairie was carved into homesteads. She stopped the wagon by the porch and climbed down, boots squelching in the wet earth. "All right," she said, untying the rope around their wrists. "Inside, with you. We'll get you dry." The tallest child went first, followed by the middle one. The smallest lingered, their head tilted up toward her. "Go on," Ruth said softly. The child stepped forward but paused on the porch. "You still don't remember me." Ruth felt a strange chill, one that had nothing to do with the rain. She knelt slightly so she was eye level with the burlap sack. "Should I?" There was no answer, only a small shake of the head before. The child followed the others inside. Ruth stayed on the porch a moment longer, the wind brushing damp strands of hair against her cheeks. She had the unsettling feeling that she was standing at the edge of something she hadn't asked for and didn't understand. Inside, she found them standing awkwardly in the kitchen, dripping water onto the floorboards. She fetched 3 old quilts from the cedar chest and draped them over their narrow shoulders. The smallest child's sack was damp and clinging to their face. Ruth's hands twitched with the urge to pull it off, but something stopped her, something about the way they stood, still as stone, as if waiting for her to do exactly that. Instead, she stepped back. "We'll get some food in you, then talk, and maybe, just maybe, you'll tell me who you really are." The smallest child's head tilted again. "Maybe you already know." And for reasons she couldn't explain, Ruth felt her heart skip. The fire in the kitchen stove crackled, sending waves of warmth into the room. Ruth moved about with quiet efficiency, ladling thick stew from the pot into 3 mismatched bowls. The children sat at the worn wooden table, their hands still tucked beneath the quilts she'd wrapped around them. Steam from the bowls curled upward, but none of them made a move to eat. Ruth set down the ladle and straightened. "You're going to have to take those sacks off if you want to eat properly." The tallest child shifted in their chair, but didn't reach for the burlap. The middle one stared at the tabletop, lips pressed tight. Only the smallest turned their head toward her. "Will you do it?" the little one asked. The question caught Ruth off guard. "You can't do it yourself." They shook their head. With a sigh, Ruth walked over. Standing behind the smallest, she reached for the frayed edge of the sack and hesitated. Something about the way the 3 of them had been brought out at the auction, faces hidden from sight, gnawed at her. People hid things for a reason, and in her years on the frontier, she'd learned those reasons were rarely good. Still, she took hold of the sack and lifted it free. A small, pale face was revealed, delicate features, dirt smudged across the cheeks, a faint bruise near the temple. Big eyes, gray like a stormy sky, blinked up at her. Ruth froze. She knew those eyes. Not in the casual way one recognizes someone from town. No, those eyes belonged to a memory she'd buried deep, from long before her husband, before the ranch, before the quiet life she'd made for herself. "Do you remember now?" the little girl asked softly. Ruth didn't answer. Her chest felt tight, as if the air in the room had grown heavier. She moved to the tallest child next, pulling off their sack with deliberate slowness. Underneath was a boy of about 10, his hair dark and unruly, his gaze sharp and watchful. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he glanced toward the smallest child, as if waiting for a signal. Ruth turned to the middle child. Another girl, perhaps 8, with straw blonde hair that fell into her face. She was thinner than the others, her skin pale from too many days indoors or too little food. Ruth stepped back, holding all 3 sacks in her hands. "You're not strangers." The smallest girl nodded. "No, ma'am." Then why? Ruth's voice caught. Why hide your faces? Because not everyone is meant to see us, the boy said quietly. His voice had a hard edge for someone so young, and not everyone would believe you if you told them. Ruth stared at him, confusion deepening. Believe what? That we belong to you. The smallest girl replied. The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. Belong to me. I've never seen you before in my life. The girl tilted her head. You saw me once, you just don't remember. Ruth's hands tightened around the sacks. She'd dealt with her share of strange folk drifters who told tall tales. Peddlers with too many secrets, but these were children, and children didn't invent something like this without reason. The boy leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. We were told to find you. We were told you'd keep us safe. Ruth's pulse quickened. Who told you that? The smallest girl's eyes softened. Your husband. The room seemed to tilt. Her husband, Daniel Marlowe, had been dead for nearly a decade, trampled in a cattle stampede that she'd witnessed herself. She'd buried him on the back hill, beneath the cottonwood tree that had shaded their wedding day. That's impossible, Ruth whispered. The boy shrugged. Maybe, but he told us your name. He told us where to go, and he told us you'd understand. Eventually, Ruth shook her head, trying to dispel the chill crawling up her spine. This is some kind of game, or someone put you up to this. The smallest girl looked down at her bowl. If it's a game, ma'am, it's the kind you can't walk away from. They began to eat then, as if nothing strange had been said at all. Ruth stood there a long moment, watching them, her mind spinning. When they finished, she showed them to the small room upstairs, the one that had been her husband's study before she closed it off. As they settled in, the little girl paused. In the doorway, you'll remember soon, she said, almost kindly, and when you do, you'll understand why we had to find you. Ruth said nothing. She closed the door and leaned against the hallway wall, listening to the rain pick up again outside, somewhere in the quiet house. She thought she heard Daniel's voice, low, warm, and gone far to long whisper her name. The next morning. Ruth woke before dawn, her mind still tangled in the children's strange words. She busied herself with chores, milking the cow, feeding the chickens, checking the fence line, but every task seemed to bring her thoughts back to the same place. Your husband told us to find you. It was absurd. Daniel had been gone for nearly 10 years, and yet, she found herself glancing toward the upstairs window where the children slept. By mid-morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the land slick and glistening under a pale sun. Ruth hitched up the wagon to haul feed from the barn to the far pasture. When she stepped inside the barn, the scent of hay and old wood wrapped around her like a familiar coat. She'd been in here 1,000 times. But today, her eyes caught on something out of place, a wooden crate shoved under the workbench, half buried in dust. She crouched down, pulling it into the light. The lid was nailed shut, but the wood was brittle with age. A few good pries with the back of a hammer, and it gave way. Inside lay a stack of oilskin-wrapped bundles. She unwrapped the first and found a small leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, but the initials stamped into it were unmistakable. DM. Ruth's throat tightened. She flipped it open, and the scent of old paper and faint tobacco drifted up. The first pages were ordinary ranch notes, supply lists, tallies of cattle sold, but midway through, the handwriting changed. It grew, hurried, urgent. If anything happens to me, they must go to Ruth. She will keep them safe. She's the only one I trust. Her eyes darted across the lines. There were mentions of 3 young ones in danger coming from the north. The last entry was dated just 2 weeks before Daniel's death. Ruth sat back on her heels, heart pounding. Daniel had never told her about any children. He'd never even hinted at something like this. She pulled another bundle from the crate. This one held 3 small tin lockets, each tied with a strip of faded red cloth. She opened the first locket. It held a tiny sketch of the smallest girl, unmistakable even beneath the artist's rough lines. The second locket showed the boy. The third, her hand froze. The third locket didn't show the blonde girl at all. Instead, it was a crude drawing of her, just as she'd looked when she was younger. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn sharply. It was the boy, his dark hair tousled from sleep. He found it, he said simply, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Ruth's mouth was dry. What is all this? Why did my husband have your pictures, and mine? The boy didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, eyeing the journal in her lap. He told us you might not believe at first. That you'd need proof. That's why we were told about the crate. You knew this was here. He nodded once. But it wasn't my place to show you. You had to find it yourself. Ruth stood, brushing hay from her skirt. I don't like riddles. Boy, I want the truth. Right now. The boy's gaze was steady, older than his years. The truth is, we were his before you were his. Not by blood, by promise. A sharp chill ran through her. Promise to who? To a man, Daniel said, was his brother. The boy said, a man who's dead now, because of the same people. Who would come for us if we didn't find you? The barn felt colder somehow, though the sun still streamed through the slats. And why hide your faces at the auction? Ruth asked. The boy glanced toward the house. Because there are people in this town who know what we look like, and they wouldn't have let you take us. Before she could press further, the blonde girl appeared in the doorway, her small voice breaking the heavy air. There's a rider coming, Ruth fast. Ruth's instincts, honed from years on the frontier, kicked in. She shoved the journal and lockets back into the crate and covered it with a feed sack. Outside, the sound of hooves grew louder. Whoever it was, they weren't coming for a friendly visit. Ruth glanced toward the children, 3 pairs of eyes fixed on her, waiting to see if she would protect them. And for the first time since hearing their strange claims, she felt the weight of Daniel's trust settle squarely on her shoulders. The pounding of hooves grew sharper, closer, until Ruth could feel it in her chest, like the thud of a war drum. Dust trailed in the distance, rising into the pale morning sky. Inside, Ruth said sharply, ushering the children toward the house. They hesitated, especially the boy, but one look from her sent them moving. She grabbed the rifle from its rack near the barn door and stepped into the yard, her boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. The rider broke into view, tall in the saddle, wrapped in a long black coat that snapped in the wind. His horse, a lean sorrel, was lathered with sweat, its breath coming in ragged bursts. The man slowed only when he reached the front gate, sitting his horse like he owned the land. "Morning," he called, voice low and gravelly. Ruth kept the rifle in plain view but didn't raise it. "You're on private land. State your business." The man's eyes swept the yard, the barn, the porch where the door had just shut behind the children. "Name's Silas Ward," he said finally. "I'm looking for 3 runaways. You might have seen M." Ruth's jaw tightened. "Can't say I have." Silas studied her like a man inspecting a horse before purchase. Deliberate, seeing far more than he let on. "Smallest one's a girl with hair the color of straw. The boy's dark, older than she is, and the third, well, she's the one you really ought to be concerned about." Something in his tone made Ruth's skin prickle. "If they're runaways, I reckon they belong somewhere else. Try the sheriff." Silas smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriffs know help. Town's full of folks who'd rather not get involved. But you, Mrs. Marlowe, you've got a reputation for taking in strays." Ruth's fingers itched to tighten on the rifle. "Then you've heard wrong. I keep to myself, not lately, you don't." His gaze flicked toward the house for a second, but it was enough to make Ruth's stomach drop. "Best you turn that horse around," she said, her voice cold steel now. "Ain't nothing for you here." Silas leaned forward slightly, resting a gloved hand on his saddle horn. "You know what happens to folks who stick their noses where they don't belong." "I've buried a husband," Ruth replied evenly. "If you think I scare easy, you'll find yourself mistaken." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft creak of leather and the restless shifting of the sorrel's hooves. Then Silas's smirk faded. "You've been warned," he said, tugging the reins. He turned the horse in a slow circle, eyes never leaving hers, before riding back the way he'd come. Ruth stood motionless until the dust cloud began to fade. Only then did she lower the rifle. Inside, the children were huddled near the kitchen table. The smallest girl, Mary, looked like she might cry, but the boy stepped forward. "That man's dangerous," he said. "If he's found us, others will come too." Ruth set the rifle down against the wall. "Start talking. Who is he?" The boy hesitated. "He used to work for the man Daniel called his brother. After he died, Silas took over what was left of his men. They don't forgive debts, and they don't let people walk away." "What debts?" Ruth pressed. The blonde girl, Lana, spoke softly. "We were the debt." The room seemed to tilt slightly beneath Ruth's feet. "What does that mean?" Mary's voice trembled. "We were promised to a man in exchange for land and cattle. But Daniel took us away before it could happen. He said we were his responsibility now, and that if anything happened to him, you would keep us safe." Ruth's mind was a storm of questions. Why hadn't Daniel told her? Why had he carried such a secret? But the image of Silas's cold stare kept pushing them aside. She pulled out a chair and sat heavily. "If that man comes back, it won't be for a friendly chat. We'll need to be ready." The boy's expression hardened. "Then teach us. We can help defend the place." Ruth looked at their thin arms, their worn clothes, the fear etched into their faces. They weren't fighters, they were children, but something in the boy's eyes told her they'd already survived more than most grown men. She stood again, a decision settling into her bones. "All right," she said quietly, "but you follow my lead, always." Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the faint echo of hooves far off on the ridge. By mid-afternoon, the wind had shifted. It came in low and steady from the east, carrying with it a faint dryness that warned of dust storms and trouble. Ruth worked the ranch yard with a quiet urgency, her eyes constantly darting to the ridgeline beyond the far pasture. The children followed her in a wary silence at first, watching how she moved, how her gaze measured everything. Finally, she stopped near the woodpile and set the rifle across her knees. "You all want to stay here?" she asked, her voice flat. They nodded. "Then you're going to work for it. That means learning to keep this place safe." The boy, Thomas, stepped forward. "We can learn fast. I'm counting on it." She handed him the rifle, watched him hold it like he'd seen others do, but without true steadiness. She corrected his grip, then showed him how to brace his shoulder, how to line his sight. Anna and Mary watched intently from the fence rail. You aim only if you have to, Ruth told Thomas, and if you do, you don't hesitate. Hesitation is how you die. The words were sharp, but there was no cruelty in them, just truth. She spent the next hour showing them how to move quietly across the yard without being seen from the road, how to take cover behind the water trough, the shed, the thick posts of the porch. They practiced ducking out of sight at her signal, and by the third round, even Mary could vanish from view in seconds. Inside the house, she showed them how to secure the doors with more than just a latch, wedging a length of wood into the frame, draping quilts over windows to keep light from spilling out at night. As the sun began to dip lower, Ruth lit the fire in the kitchen stove. The smell of cornbread and beans began to fill the air, masking the tension that hung like a taut rope. While the food cooked, she leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I need to know everything about this Silas Ward, she said. Thomas exchanged a glance with Anna before answering. He's not the one who made the deal for us. That was another man, Clyde Mercer. But Silas was his right hand. After Clyde was killed in a dispute with Daniel, Silas swore he'd collect what he said was owed, which was you three. Ruth asked. Anna nodded, her face pale. Clyde used to trade children, sell them. We were next. Daniel found out and took us before it could happen. Ruth felt her jaw tighten. The idea of those sacks over their heads at the auction made sickening sense now. Mary's small voice cut in. Daniel said you'd know what to do. That's why I said your name. The weight of that trust settled on Ruth like a heavy cloak. She wasn't sure she deserved it, but she couldn't ignore it either. They ate quickly, the silence broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls. Outside, the sky had turned the deep rust of an approaching dusk. After supper, Ruth led them to the barn. She showed them the old storage loft above the hay bales, explaining how it could be a hiding place if the worst came. She placed an oil lamp, a jug of water, and a small tin of biscuits up there just in case. Thomas didn't like the idea. If they come, I want to fight. You'll do as I say, Ruth told him, her tone leaving no room for argument. Staying alive is the only victory that matters right now. They worked until the moon was high, the ranch yard now a map of escape routes, cover points, and fallback positions. The children moved with more confidence. Their earlier fear hardened into something closer to determination. As they settled in for the night, Ruth sat by the window with the rifle across her lap. The fire had burned low, casting the room in shadows. She could hear the children breathing evenly in the next room. The soft rustle of blankets. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, a coyote howled long and mournful. But under it, she thought she heard something else, the faint, rhythmic beat of hooves. Her hand tightened on the rifle. The sound of hoofbeats came first, faint as a heartbeat in a dream. Ruth sat motionless by the window, eyes narrowing, her breath slow and measured. Outside, the moon spilled silver over the yard, but the far edges of the pasture were swallowed. In blackness, the hoofbeats grew louder, more than one horse. She moved without sound, crossing to the children's room. Thomas stirred when she shook his shoulder, eyes snapping open in alarm. They're here, she whispered, his jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He roused Anna and Mary while Ruth slipped to the front door, checking the barricade she'd said earlier. The thud of hooves stopped just beyond the main gate. Voices murmured low, male, and wrong. Ruth returned to the children, ushering them toward the barn in the dark. The night air was cold enough to bite, but they made no sound except for the soft crunch of dirt under bare feet. Up, she whispered once they reached the barn, pointing to the loft. Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the house, but she fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. They climbed silently, pulling the quilt over themselves. The lamp unlit. Ruth shut the barn door and slid the wooden bar into place before crossing the yard again, rifle in hand. She kept to the shadows, her steps careful and deliberate. The riders were dismounting now, 3 of them. The leader, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, leaned against the fence as though he owned the place. His voice carried in the stillness. Evening, Miss Marlowe. Fine night, ain't it? She recognized him instantly. Silas Ward. His voice had the slick drawl of someone who thought charm was as dangerous as a blade. State your business, she called, her voice steady. He chuckled. You got something belongs to me. Can't take what's not yours, she replied. Depends who's keeping the books, Silas said. He stepped closer, and the 2 men with him fanned out, one drifting toward the side of the house, the other toward the barn. Ruth's stomach tightened. If they got near the barn, they'd hear or smell the children. She shifted her stance, raising the rifle. Don't take another step. The man heading for the barn froze, glancing back at Silas. Silas's smile didn't falter. You planning to shoot me, Ruth? That'd be a shame. Daniel thought you were better than that. The mention of Daniel sent a ripple through her, but she didn't lower the gun. Daniel's not here, and I'm not letting you near those kids. Silas took one more step, You think you can keep them from me? I've been doing this a long time. Ruth, you hold out. Maybe you get a week, maybe less. But in the end, folks like me always collect. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind sliding over the dry grass. Then a sudden crash shattered the stillness. The barn door, rattling against its hinges. The man near the barn had tried to force it open. Leave it, Silas barked, but Ruth had already fired. The shot ripped through the night, echoing off the hills. The man at the barn staggered back, clutching his arm, cursing. The horses spooked, snorting and stamping. Silas's smile vanished. You just made this real, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Was real the moment you set foot on my land. She shot back. For a tense second, Ruth thought he might rush her, but instead, Silas jerked his chin toward his wounded man. We'll be back, and when we come, you'd better think hard about what kind of ending you want. They mounted up and rode off into the night, the hoofbeats fading until there was only the wind again. Ruth lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed, at least for the moment. She glanced toward the barn, knowing that children had heard every word. Inside, she found Thomas peering through the loft slats, his face pale but set. Anna clung to Mary, both of them wide-eyed. They'll come back, won't they? Thomas asked. Yes, Ruth said simply. And next time, they won't be so polite. Her voice was calm, but in her chest, her heart was a drum. Tomorrow, she would need to make a run, or make this land a place no one dared step on again. The night after Silas Ward's visit was long and sleepless. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, lantern burning low, the rifle across her lap. Every creak of the house sounded like an intruder. She knew Silas's type. He wouldn't bluff, and he wouldn't forgive. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She wasn't going to run. When Thomas shuffled into the kitchen, still bleary-eyed, she was already setting a pot of coffee on the stove. Wake your sisters, she told him. We've got work to do. An hour later, the children were out in the yard, under a pale gold sky, helping her drag lumber from the shed. She showed them how to brace the barn door with heavy beams, how to nail boards across the lower windows of the house. Thomas caught on quick, hammering in silence, his jaw tight. Anna carried nails and an apron, and little Mary trotted between them with cups of water. By midday, the yard looked like a fortress. The corral gate was locked with chain, the barn reinforced, the porch piled with sacks of feed that could double as cover. You think this'll stop them? Thomas asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. It'll slow them, Ruth said, and slowing them gives us the only thing that matters: time to aim. They ate early, the sun sinking low behind the hills, shadows stretching long across the yard. The air felt heavy, like the moments before a summer storm. Ruth kept glancing at the ridge to the east, waiting. She didn't wait long. The first rider crested the hill at twilight, then two more, and then the rest, 6 in total. Silas at the lead. They rode slow, the way men do when they want you to. Watch them coming. The faint jingle of tack and the hollow thud of hooves carried in the still air. The children were inside now, peeking from the upstairs window. Ruth stood on the porch, rifle in hand. Silas reined in at the fence, tipping his hat with mock politeness. Evening, Ruth. I gave you a night to think. I'm here for my answer. You got it last night, she said evenly. Silas sighed, glancing at his men. You're making this harder than it needs to be. That's the thing, Ruth said, raising the rifle. Hard's the only way I do it. The crack of the shot split the evening. One of Silas's men yelped, his hat flying off as the bullet grazed him. The horses skittered, but the men recovered quick, fanning out like wolves. Ruth dropped behind the sacks on the porch as the first return shots rang out, splinters flying from the railing. She fired again, forcing them to keep their heads low. From upstairs, Thomas shouted, to heading for the barn. Ruth pivoted, firing toward the figures moving in the shadows. One stumbled, clutching his leg. The other ducked behind the trough. Then, she heard it, a sound like tearing canvas. The front fence gave way under a horse's weight. Silas, driving it hard, he vaulted from the saddle before it stopped moving, hitting the porch in a crouch. Ruth swung the rifle toward him, but he lunged, knocking it aside. The weapon clattered across the boards. They grappled in the dust, Silas's breath hot with whiskey. You're stubborn, Ruth, he growled, but stubborn don't keep you alive. She drove her knee into his stomach, hard. He doubled over just enough for her to grab the short-handled axe from the woodpile. He froze at the sight of it, eyes narrowing. You wouldn't. Ruth's voice was cold. Try me. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats rose again, not from Silas's men, but from the west. A small group of riders crested the far ridge, rifles in hand. Ruth recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Dawes. Drop it, Ward, the sheriff barked. For the first time, Silas's composure cracked. He stepped back, hands raised just enough to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. His men, seeing the odds turn, began retreating toward their horses. This ain't over. Silas spat. It is for you, Dawes said flatly. Get out of this county before sundown tomorrow or I'll see you hang. Minutes later, the yard was empty, but for Ruth, the children and the smell of gunpowder in the cooling air. Inside, Mary ran to her arms, tight around Ruth's waist. "I was scared," she whispered. Ruth knelt, pulling all three close. "Me, too," she admitted. "But we're still here, and we'll keep being here." That night, as the house settled into quiet, Ruth stood at the window, looking out over the darkened pasture. The ridge was just a shadow now, but it felt different, like it belonged to her again. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a woman merely surviving. She felt like someone who had claimed her place and the children who now shared it.